The terminal at Los Angeles International Airport was a sea of chaos. It was a bright, noisy Tuesday afternoon, and the air was filled with the sound of rolling suitcase wheels clattering over tiles, loudspeaker announcements echoing off the high ceilings, and the general hum of hundreds of conversations all happening at once. People were rushing to gates, checking their watches, and gripping their coffee cups like lifelines. In the middle of all this frantic energy, one man moved with a completely different rhythm. He didn't rush. He didn't check his watch. He just walked, a steady, calm presence in a river of stress. He was tall, but he didn't carry himself in a way that demanded space. He wore a simple, dark jacket that had seen better days, a pair of jeans that were comfortable rather than stylish, and heavy boots that looked like they had walked 1,000 miles. On his head sat a worn cap, pulled down low, and a pair of dark glasses covered his eyes. To anyone passing by, he was just another traveler. He looked like a musician who had spent the night on a friend's couch, or maybe a college professor who didn't care much for fashion. He was unassuming, he was quiet, and he was completely, utterly unnoticed. This man was Keanu Reeves. But for today, on this flight, he was just another passenger trying to get from one coast to the other. He approached the gate area and found a spot near a large window. He didn't sit in the priority seating area, though he certainly could have. He just leaned against the wall, his hands in his pockets, watching the planes out on the tarmac. He had learned a long time ago that fame was a strange thing. Some days it was a warm embrace from the world, and other days it was a cage. He had found that the best way to move through the world was to simply be part of it. He liked watching people. He liked the anonymity of a crowd. A few feet away, a young woman was struggling. She had a toddler on one hip and a diaper bag slipping off her other shoulder, while she tried to collapse a stroller with her free hand. The stroller was jammed. The toddler was crying. People walked past her, dodging her like she was an obstacle in a video game. They were too busy, too focused on their own flights, or too polite to get involved. Keanu pushed off the wall. He walked over without a word. He didn't make a big show of it. He just stepped in and took hold of the stroller. He gave a firm jiggle and a click, and the latch released. He folded it up neatly and set against the wall. The mother looked up, flustered and grateful. "Thank you so much," she breathed, shifting the baby. "I thought I was going to be stuck here all day." He smiled. It was a genuine, soft smile that reached his eyes behind the dark glasses. "It's tricky gear," he said, his voice low and calm. "Have a safe flight." He turned away before she could really look at him, before she could recognize the sharp jawline or the distinct way he spoke. He drifted back into the crowd, becoming invisible again. It was a superpower he had cultivated over the years, the ability to help and then disappear. When the boarding announcement finally came over the intercom, the line formed instantly. It was the usual crush of people wanting to be first, even though they had assigned seats. Keanu stayed back. He waited until the line had thinned out. He wasn't in a hurry. The plane wasn't leaving without him. He picked up his small travel bag, a beat-up backpack that looked like it held nothing more than a change of clothes and a book. He adjusted the collar of his jacket. Underneath the fabric, hidden against his chest, a small, silver pendant rested against the skin. It wasn't flashy. It was a simple chain with a small, weathered charm. It meant something to him. It was private. He touched his chest briefly, a habit he had, ensuring it was there, then stepped into the line. As he walked down the jet bridge, the smell of jet fuel and recycled air washed over him. It was the smell of travel. He stepped onto the plane and gave a polite nod to the first flight attendant at the door. She was busy checking a manifest and didn't look up. He moved down the narrow aisle, squeezing past a large man in a suit who was blocking the row while stuffing an oversized bag into the overhead bin. "Excuse me," Keanu said politely, ducking past. He found his seat. It was an aisle seat toward the back of the plane. He liked the aisle. He could stretch his legs, and he could see what was happening. He lifted his backpack and placed it in the overhead bin. He sat down and buckled his seatbelt. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair, which was getting a little long. He looked tired, but it was a peaceful kind of tired. Around him, the plane filled up. A businessman in a crisp suit sat next to him, immediately pulling out his phone to fire off angry emails. Across the aisle, an older woman pulled a knit blanket out of her purse. The plane was a village of strangers, thrown together for a few hours. Keanu pulled a book out of his back pocket. It was a worn paperback. The spine cracked from multiple readings. He opened it and began to read, tuning out the noise of the crying babies and the rustle of snack bags. He felt the vibration of the plane as the engines roared to life. He loved this part, the moment just before takeoff when the world was about to fall away. He leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes for a moment. He was just a guy going home, or maybe going to work. He was just a human being, sharing a metal tube with 100 other souls. He had no idea that just a few rows away, a storm was brewing. He had no idea that his peaceful flight was about to turn into something else entirely. For now, he was content. He was comfortable, and as the plane began to taxi toward the runway, Keanu Reeves opened his book and turned the page, completely unaware of the eyes that were already watching him. Kicked off a flight was a nightmare. It meant misconnections, lost money, and hours of hassle. She was using a nuclear bomb to kill a fly. She was threatening to ruin his day over a tiny piece of silver. The people around them shifted uncomfortably. A few passengers shook their heads. They could see it was unfair. They could see she was bullying him. But no one spoke up yet. They just watched, waiting to see what the man in the rumpled jacket would do. Keanu looked at her. He looked at the hard line of her mouth and the coldness in her eyes. He realized that this wasn't a debate. It was a power trip. He slowly closed his book all the way and placed it in the seat pocket in front of him. He didn't want to be the center of attention. He didn't want to be the guy who gets dragged off a plane. He just wanted to fly home. His hand drifted up to his neck. He touched the clasp of the chain. The metal was warm from his skin. He held it for a second, his thumb brushing over the pendant. It was a moment of quiet surrender. He was choosing peace over pride. He was giving her what she wanted, simply because it wasn't worth the fight. But as his fingers worked the tiny clasp, he could feel the mood in the cabin shifting. The tension was thick. He looked up one last time, his eyes sad but kind. "Okay," he whispered, loud enough for her to hear. "Okay." The small metal clasp of the necklace was slippery between his fingers. Keanu fumbled with it for a second, his hand steady, but his movements slow. He wasn't stalling. He was just trying to process the sheer, unnecessary nature of the moment. The engines outside were roaring louder now, the plane inching forward on the tarmac. But inside the cabin, time seemed to have frozen. The air conditioning vent above him rattled softly, a rhythmic sound that usually put people to sleep, but right now, it was just background noise to a public shaming. The flight attendant didn't step back to give him room. She stood right there, hovering over him like a hawk. Her eyes were narrowed, scanning his face for any sign of resistance. She wanted him to fight back. She seemed to be itching for a reason to escalate things further, to prove that she was the one in charge. "Come on," she said, her voice dripping with impatience. "We don't have all day. The plane isn't going to wait, because you can't follow a simple dress code." A few rows back, someone coughed nervously. The tension was spreading. It was like a cold wave moving through the cabin. People who had been ignoring the commotion, lost in their phones or books, were now fully alert. There is a specific kind of human instinct that kicks in when someone is being treated unfairly. It's a mix of discomfort and a strange, voyeuristic need to see how it ends. The passengers were on edge. They could feel that this wasn't right. Keanu finally managed to unhook the clasp. The chain went slack in his hand. He held the small pendant in his palm for a moment. It was a small, dark circle of metal, worn smooth by years of touching. He looked at it, his expression unreadable. To anyone else, it might look like a trinket from a pawn shop, something bought for $10. But to him, it was a weight of memories, a connection to things lost and things remembered. Taking it off felt like peeling off a layer of armor he wore against the world. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't use his status. He simply pulled the chain out from under his shirt. The movement was gentle, but the flight attendant wasn't done. As the silver link slid out from under his collar, she let out a short, sharp scoff. She looked at the necklace in his hand with visible disdain. Her lip curled up at the corner. "Honestly," she muttered, loud enough for the 3 rows surrounding them to hear, "you people make such a fuss over the cheapest things. You dress like you don't have two nickels to rub together, and then you throw a fit over a 10-cent chain. It's ridiculous. It was a verbal slap. She was attacking him, not for breaking a rule, but for who she thought he was. Because his jacket was old and his boots were worn, she had judged him. In her mind, he was a nobody. He was someone who didn't matter. She was mocking his poverty, or what she assumed was his poverty. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated snobbery. The businessman sitting next to Keanu shifted uncomfortably. He looked from the flight attendant to the man in the old jacket. The businessman had been annoyed when the commotion started, worried about missing his connection, but now he looked offended. The insult was too personal. It was too mean. The old woman across the aisle stopped knitting. Her hands froze in midair. She glared at the back of the flight attendant's head. It was one thing to enforce safety. It was another thing entirely to mock a passenger's dignity. Keanu looked up at the woman standing over him. He didn't look angry. If anything, his expression was one of deep, profound pity. He had met people like her before. He knew that people who needed to hurt others to feel powerful were usually hurting the most inside. He knew that her words said nothing about him and everything about her. He held the necklace out to her. He wasn't going to put it in his pocket. He was going to let her take it. He wanted to show her that her cruelty could not touch him. "Here," Keanu said quietly. "You can have it." The flight attendant blinked, surprised. She hadn't expected him to surrender it so easily. She had expected an argument. She had expected him to get defensive. His calmness threw her off balance. She reached out, her fingers grasping for the silver chain. "Put it in your bag," she snapped, recovering her composure quickly. "I don't want to touch your things. Just stow it away and keep your hands where I can see them until we reach cruising altitude." She was backing down, but she was trying to save face. She couldn't just let him hand it to her. That would mean he was being cooperative, and she needed to be the one giving orders. Keanu nodded. He curled his fingers back around the pendant and dropped it into the pocket of his jeans. He zipped the pocket shut. The motion was final. "Done," he said. The flight attendant stood there for a second longer, looking for any sign of malice or rebellion in his face. She found none. He was like a still lake, calm on the surface, with depth she couldn't begin to understand. It frustrated her. She felt like she had won, but the victory fell hollow. He hadn't crumbled. He hadn't gotten angry. He had just absorbed it. "Good," she said, smoothing her skirt. She turned on her heel, her shoes clicking sharply against the floor. She walked toward the front of the plane with her head held high, but there was a stiffness in her shoulders now. She knew people were watching her. She could feel the weight of their judgment on her back. As she moved away, the cabin let out a collective breath. The spell was broken. The plane began to accelerate down the runway, the force of the engines pushing everyone back into their seats. The businessman next to Keanu leaned over slightly. "I'm sorry about that," the businessman whispered, leaning in close so the other passengers wouldn't hear. "She's out of line." Keanu just offered a tired, faint smile. He patted his pocket where the necklace rested. "It's okay," he whispered back. "Everyone has a bad day." He settled back into his seat, closing his eyes as the plane lifted off the ground, leaving the earth behind. He just wanted a piece of the sky. He didn't know that the storm wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning to brew, and it was coming from the passengers around him who had seen enough. The flight attendant had won the battle over the necklace, but she was about to lose the war for respect. The plane settled into the smooth air of cruising altitude. The heavy vibration of takeoff faded into a steady, low hum. Above the passengers, the ding of the seatbelt sign turning off sounded like a collective sigh of relief. People began to move. Laptop bags were pulled from under seats, and the flight attendant started preparing the drink carts in the small galley kitchen at the front of the plane. The tension from the confrontation a few minutes earlier had dissipated slightly, turning into a heavy, awkward silence in the back rows. The flight attendant who had caused the scene was now busy in the front. Her back turned to the cabin, loudly rattling ice scoops into plastic cups. She seemed to have moved on, convinced that she had successfully put a rude passenger in his place. She felt satisfied. She had enforced the rules. She had won. But in row 24, the atmosphere was entirely different. The businessman sitting next to Keanu was still fidgeting. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced sideways at the man he had just witnessed get publicly humiliated. Keanu had opened his book again, his finger tracing the lines of text. He looked perfectly at peace. He wasn't brooding. He wasn't complaining. He was just reading. The businessman felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't said anything when the flight attendant was mocking the man. He had stayed silent to avoid trouble. Now, looking at the calm, kind face of the man next to him, he felt a bit cowardly. He cleared his throat, trying to break the ice. "I really am sorry about that," the businessman whispered again, leaning closer. "She had no right to speak to you like that. It was unprofessional." Keanu looked up. He smiled, a small, crinkly smile that touched his eyes. He tapped the cover of his book gently. "Don't worry about it," Keanu said softly. "Everyone has a job to do. Sometimes the job gets in the way of seeing people. It's all right." The businessman blinked. The response was so kind, so devoid of ego that it threw him off. Most people he knew, himself included, would have been fuming. They would have demanded the attendant's name. They would have written a letter to the airline. But this man just offered grace. "You're very understanding," the businessman said, shaking his head. "More than I would be." Just then, a movement from the row behind them caught their attention. A teenage boy, maybe 16 or 17 years old, had been leaning forward, trying to get a look at the commotion earlier. He had shaggy hair and was wearing a hoodie with a band logo on the front. He had been watching the interaction closely, his brow furrowed in concentration. He hadn't been looking at the flight attendant. He had been staring at the back of the passenger's head. Now, the boy leaned over the armrest of his seat, poking his head into the space between Keanu and the window. He ignored the businessman entirely. His eyes were wide, locked onto Keanu's face. He looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle that had been bothering him for the last 20 minutes. "Hey," the boy said. His voice cracked slightly, a mix of teenage awkwardness and sudden adrenaline. Keanu turned his head slightly, looking over his shoulder. "Hello," he said politely. The boy swallowed hard. He pointed a shaking finger at Keanu. "I know why you look familiar. I've been staring at the poster on my wall for 3 years. The businessman looked at the boy, confused. The old woman across the aisle lowered her magazine again. "You're him, aren't you?" the boy asked, his voice rising an octave. You're the guy. John Wick. The Matrix. You're Keanu." The name dropped into the conversation, like a stone into a still pond. For a second, there was silence. The businessman froze, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. The name hung in the recycled air. Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't look around to see who was watching. He just gave the boy that same humble, gentle look. He lowered his book fully. "Yeah," Keanu said, his voice barely a whisper. "That's me." The boy's face exploded into a grin of pure joy. He didn't scream, but he did let out a sharp breath of disbelief. He slapped the armrest in excitement. "No way. Mom!" he hissed, turning around to shake the woman sleeping next to him. "Mom, wake up. It's Keanu Reeves." The businessman nearly dropped his coffee. His head whipped back to the man in the rumpled jacket. He looked again. He looked at the jawline, the dark hair, the eyes that suddenly seemed very recognizable. How had he missed it? The realization hit the businessman like a physical force. He was sitting next to a movie legend, a cultural icon, and he had just watched this icon get treated like a bum for wearing a sentimental necklace. "Oh my God," the businessman whispered, his face turning pale. "You're Keanu Reeves." Across the aisle, the old woman gasped. She reached out and touched Keanu's sleeve gently. "I loved you in that movie with the bus," she said softly, her eyes twinkling. "Speed. Wonderful film." Keanu nodded at her. "Thank you. That was a long time ago." The news began to travel. It wasn't a shout. It was a ripple. It moved from row to row, past in hushed, excited tones. "Asterisk, hey, that guy in the back? It's Keanu Reeves." Asterisk, the one the flight attendant yelled at. Asterisk, yes. "It's him." Asterisk. Heads began to turn. Subtle glances became outright stares. People adjusted their mirrors to get a better look. They saw him, but more importantly, They saw the context. They saw the drunk or homeless man the flight attendant had assumed he was, and they realized she had made a terrible mistake. The passenger in the rumpled jacket wasn't a nobody. He was a man worth millions, a star adored by millions, and he had taken the abuse with a quiet dignity that stunned everyone. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from awkward tension to protective adoration. The passengers felt a sudden, fierce sense of injustice. They realized that the flight attendant hadn't just insulted a man. She had insulted a beloved figure, and she had done it based on nothing but his clothes. The drink cart was making its way down the aisle, steered by the very flight attendant who had caused the trouble. She was chatting loudly with a colleague about their schedules, completely unaware of the shift in energy. She was approaching Keanu's row now, ready to ask for drink orders with the same air of superiority. The businessman saw her coming. He sat up straighter. He saw the flight attendant's eyes scan the row, looking past Keanu at first. Then she noticed a look on the teenager's face, the look of starstruck awe. She noticed the old woman leaning into the aisle, smiling warmly at the man in 24B. She stopped the cart. She looked down at Keanu. She looked at the businessman, who was staring at her with a mixture of shock and disgust. She looked at the teenager, who was mouthing the words "It's Keanu Reeves" to his friends a few rows back. The flight attendant froze. Her hand, holding a plastic cup, hovered in midair. Her eyes widened. She looked at Keanu's face again, really looking this time, stripping away the old jacket and the uncombed hair. The realization crashed into her like a wave. She knew that face. Everyone knew that face. The color began to drain from her cheeks. Her superior smirk vanished, replaced by a look of dawning horror. She had just threatened to kick Keanu Reeves off a plane over a necklace. She had called him poor. She had mocked his appearance. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The silence at the back of the plane was deafening, and all eyes were on her. The flight attendant stood there, gripping the handle of the drink cart so tightly her knuckles turned white. The hum of the plane's engine seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed the teenager's revelation. She looked down at the passenger in the rumpled jacket, the man she had just belittled, mocked, and nearly threatened with removal. It wasn't just a passenger she had targeted. It was Keanu Reeves. Her face went through a rapid transformation. The stern, superior mask she had been wearing crumbled instantly. It was replaced by a look of pure, unmasked panic. Her eyes darted around the cabin. She could feel the weight of every single pair of eyes on her. The passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were judging. They had seen what she had done. They had heard the nasty comments about his clothes and his cheap jewelry. And now, they knew exactly who they were protecting. The color rose in her cheeks, a bright, burning red that spread down her neck. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She looked like a deer caught in the blinding headlights of an oncoming truck. She knew, in that agonizing moment, that she had made a terrible, career-threatening mistake. I didn't... She stammered, her voice losing all of its previous authority. It came out thin and shaky. She looked at Keanu, searching his face for anger, for the outrage she knew she deserved. "Mr. Reeves, I am so sorry. I didn't realize it was you." It was a weak apology. The passengers around him shifted in their seats. The businessman next to Keanu let out a low, scoffing breath. He saw what the flight attendant was doing. She wasn't sorry that she had been rude to a human being. She was sorry that she had been rude to a celebrity. She was sorry because she was scared of the consequences. The teenage boy behind him leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Wait," the boy said, loud enough for the rows around him to hear. "It would have been okay to treat him like that if he wasn't famous? That's the problem?" The flight attendant flinched as if she had been slapped. She looked at the teenager, then back at Keanu. She realized she had walked right into a trap of her own making. She had no defense. The cabin was silent, waiting to see what would happen next. It was the kind of tension that makes the air feel thick. Keanu looked up at her. He didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. His face was calm, open, and impossibly kind. He saw the fear in her eyes. He saw the humiliation she was feeling. Instead of enjoying her discomfort or using his status to lecture her, he did something that surprised everyone. He reached out and gently touched the side of the drink cart, stopping its slight rattle. "It's quite all right," Keanu said. His voice was soft, carrying just enough weight to break the tension. You were doing your job. Safety is important. He gave her an out. He gave her a ladder to climb down from the high horse she had fallen off of. He didn't have to do that. He could have demanded her badge number. He could have made a scene. But he didn't. The flight attendant blinked, stunned by his mercy. But I was rude about your necklace. I shouldn't have. Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver chain. He held it up for a moment, letting the light catch the worn metal. He looked at it fondly, then looked back at her. It's just a thing, he said simply. It's not worth the trouble. We're all just trying to get where we're going. Let's just have a good flight. He unclasped the chain, and with slow, deliberate movements, he put it back around his neck. He didn't do it to defy her. He did it because he was comfortable again. He clicked the clasp shut and smoothed his shirt down. He looked up at her with a warm, expectant look. I'll just have a water, please, he said. With a lemon slice, if you have it. The flight attendant stood frozen for another second, processing the grace she had just been shown. She had tried to strip him of his dignity, and in return he had saved hers. She nodded quickly, her hand shaking as she poured a cup of water. She added the lemon slice with trembling fingers. When she handed it to him, she used both hands, almost like an offering. Thank you, she whispered. There was a lump in her throat. Thank you, Keanu replied, taking the cup. He gave her a small nod, dismissing her. He turned his attention back to his book, signaling that the incident was over. The flight attendant moved the cart forward, but her demeanor had changed completely. The arrogance was gone. She moved quietly now, keeping her head down. She didn't lecture the next passenger about their bag placement. She didn't look at anyone with judgment. The lesson had landed hard. The plane began its descent an hour later. The clouds outside the window turned into puffs of pink and orange as the sun began to set. The fastened seatbelt sign dinged on, and the passengers prepared for landing. Keanu put his book away and stared out the window, watching the city lights flicker on below. As the plane touched down with a smooth thud, the cabin erupted into the usual sounds of seatbelts unbuckling and phones turning on. But there was a different energy in the air. People were gentler. They had seen something real. The teenager behind Keanu leaned forward one last time. Mr. Reeves? He asked, his voice quiet and respectful. Keanu turned around. You're a good guy, the boy said simply. Thanks for being cool. Keanu smiled, a genuine, boyish smile that lit up his tired eyes. Be excellent to each other, he whispered, quoting his famous line with a wink. He stood up when the door opened, grabbing his beat-up backpack from the overhead bin. He threw it over one shoulder. He didn't rush to the front. He waited for the businessman next to him to gather his things. He waited for the old woman across the aisle to stand up. He offered her a hand to help her steady herself. Safe travels, he told her. As he walked down the aisle toward the exit, he passed the flight attendant. She was standing near the cockpit door, her hands folded in front of her. She looked at him with eyes that were red-rimmed. She opened her mouth to say something else, maybe another apology or maybe just a goodbye. But the words wouldn't come. She just nodded, a look of deep regret and respect on her face. Keanu nodded back. He didn't hold a grudge. He walked out of the plane and into the terminal, blending into the crowd of travelers almost instantly. He disappeared into the world, just a man in a rumpled jacket with a silver necklace around his neck. But for the people on that flight, the story wouldn't fade so quickly. As they walked the baggage claim, they talked about it in hushed tones. They talked about the woman who tried to judge a book by its cover, and the man who turned the other cheek. They realized that true class has nothing to do with uniform or a title or a fancy suit. It has nothing to do with power or enforcing rules. True class, they realized, is how you treat people who can do nothing for you. It is the grace to forgive someone who tried to hurt you. It is the strength to remain kind in a cruel moment. The flight attendant learned a lesson she would never forget, taught by a man who never raised his voice. And as the passengers spilled out into the airport night, they carried that lesson with them, reminded that sometimes the most important people in the room are the ones who act like they aren't.